Good morning. I think the mic is working. Sounds good. I think we still have a few coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started. No, I'm definitely not Scott. He asked me to fill in this morning, so we will take a short break from the normal course of study. Generally works out well for Scott to be able to continue, and that way I'm not trying to fill in for someone I'm definitely not qualified to fill in for on that level. Let's go ahead and start with a prayer this morning. Our Father in heaven, thank you for all of our blessings. Thank you for this beautiful morning that we have to gather together with fellow Christians to worship you together and to study your word. We pray this morning as we enter this time where we study your word together that we may all learn some from it, that we would grow together, and that we would be refilled to go throughout our week and live our lives trying to pattern them after the life of your Son. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. I'm going to talk about and I've talked about this some before in some of my classes, but a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and I think very pertinent for the world we live in today. And some of us may ask, why are we talking about this? I already know what I believe, but I do think it's important. Whenever you see a painting, you know that somebody made it. In fact, usually whenever you see a painting and you see another painting, you can tell who the artist is. I know whenever I draw a picture, and I'm not a great artist. I did win a blue ribbon in 4th grade at the state fair for a painting. Just saying, no, I'm not a good artist. But whenever you see art, you can look at another piece of art and see the signature in that art. Even if it's not signed, you can tell who made it. So whenever we look at the world around us, we can see God's signature. In the beginning, I like to harp on for the younger ones memorization of Scripture, and I was testing some the other day and asked them if they could quote Genesis 1:1, which I'm sure everybody in here can. We see in the book of Genesis an account for the creation of the world, and it addresses one of the most important questions, and I think one that everybody here already has an answer for. You wouldn't be here this morning. This is a question that everybody, I can't think of anyone in the world, would not ask themselves at some point in their lives this question. I think that very fact begs the question, why does everybody ask this question? Perhaps it is designed into a person to ask that very question, but that's a sidetrack. The question is there a God? And then what is the nature of that God? Well, in Genesis, it says that God created from nothing everything that is, the heavens and the earth. But what are we told in television? What are we told in science classes in school? What are we told in the world? And whenever we hear these facts, what do we generally accept? Maybe not accept, but at least don't question. Here's what science teaches. This is what they will teach in science class. This is what you will see on documentaries of nature. This is what in the West, that approximately 400 billion years ago, something happened. Now, something happened. Depends who you ask in science what that something happened is. There are many different theories for it. There is a website that I really like called evolutionnews.org, and it's actually an intelligent design website that deals with articles out of evolution. And some of us may have heard of some of the new artificial intelligences out there. It's the big thing now, artificial intelligence. ChatGPT is the big one. And one of their scientists from Evolution News had a chat with ChatGPT, asking it the narrative on how the world was created. And it took around 14 or 15 iterations through this conversation to finally get this artificial intelligence to say, well, one possibility is that God created the world. What does that matter? See, artificial intelligences really aren't intelligent. Really, they're just pretty good at plagiarism. They steal a lot of information, compile that information together, and present it to you in a way that actually can sound very intelligent. It can really seem like you're talking with a person. Well, the point of that is they're trained, they're given information, and they're given a bias. So the bias that is given to that is, it's pseudoscience. It's this far out possibility that there could be a God that created the world. All these other possibilities, for example, the most common narrative here. 400 billion years ago, something happened and created the universe. 3.7 billion years ago, life emerged on Earth from non-living matter. You ask a scientist how that happened, you know what the answer is going to be? They'll give you theories, but the answer will be, I don't know. What caused that something to happen? Well, maybe there was a Big Bang. Most scientists somewhat reject that notion now. They think they'll claim it was more of an inflationary period that created this, because that singularity just doesn't match with what they see on science. And frankly, it in some ways points to a God having created everything, and they're going to reject that notion. And so you have all that time, and then life arises from nothing, and many would say this primordial soup. So you have all these chemicals poured together, and heat and energy, and all of that creates a early RNA, ribonucleic acid. And those RNAs somehow survive in such a way that they put together a DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which is what? The pattern for how living things are built. And somehow that all came together into something that was alive. Then over the next few billion years, life evolved through very small changes over time, at least that is one of the theories that they like to present, to become much more complex life. And then around 66 million years ago, a meteor hit the Earth and wiped out much of that life. Changing the world, it brought about the rise and dominance of mammals. You had giant lizards, the dinosaurs, they ruled the world, right? Jurassic Park, loved the show. But the science and evolution behind it flies in the face of the biblical narrative of Genesis. And then approximately 2 million years ago, the first Homo sapiens, or forms of early man, evolved from primates. So what does the world teach us? What does the mainstream scientific community teach us? They teach us that things just happened by chance, and that man is no different than the animals. In fact, we're just the same thing, slightly more evolved. And if you take that to extreme, then some men are more evolved than others. Talk about that also. So we see Christianity on this hand, and science on this hand, or at least that's the way it's presented. What is science? The systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world, experimentation, and testing of theories against the evidence obtained. So in other words, according to that definition, science is just a method for testing things. Science, according to the second definition here, is any system of knowledge that is concerned with the physical world and its phenomenon, and that entails unbiased observations and systematic experimentation. In general, a science involves a pursuit of knowledge covering general truths or the operations of fundamental laws. Science is a pursuit of knowledge using a given method. What there flies in the face of religion? How is Christianity and science, how can the two not go together? There's nothing here that prohibits that. The scientific method came about how? from atheists, people who didn't believe in God? No, actually, it arose from Christian men, God-seeking men, some maybe not Christian, but at least deists who believed in God of some kind, and they came up with a method. And yet, at some point, something went wrong. Much would point to Charles Darwin, though there were many predecessors to Darwin. He at one point was a religious man, but due to many things, rejected that. But according to this artificial intelligence I was talking about, religion, the creation of God, is pseudoscience. What does that mean, pseudoscience? It means it's so far out of mainstream that sure, maybe it's worth looking into just slightly. Kind of reminds me of an episode of Friends, where one of the people in Friends, Ross, and he's an archaeologist, a scientist, and because of that, he can't accept religion in any way. And Phoebe, who is into all kinds of spiritualism and slightly weird, she's messing with him, and she's like, so you can't accept that there's even the most remote possibility that there is a God. How closed-minded are you? And he's like, well, I guess there is a remote possibility. And then she goes on to teach him about how he just threw all his views away. But the point is, there are many people who would call Christians closed-minded, these scientists, yet they themselves have their preformed ideas, a God of their own, if you would have it. But what does science have to say about the Genesis account? Universal fine-tuning. There are a lot of things in this world, in this universe, that are fundamental to physics, nature. If you were to change those, have it numerical values that define these fundamental parts of nature, then life would not exist. What are some of those things? The speed of light. If you change the speed of light, if you change the rate at which that travels and how that affects all these other constants, life does not exist. If you change the strength of gravity, well, we're either all going to float away or we're all going to be crushed, right? So life has to have those constants. In fact, one of the big problems with space travel, we want to go to Mars now, right? I'm just as good not going to Mars, but a lot of people want to go to Mars. I think I've seen what it's supposed to be like, and it doesn't sound fun to me. I already lived in the South. I know what it's like to be hot. I lived in the North. I know what it's like to be cold. I'll pass on both of those. But if you travel in space, well, your gravity is different. What happens to the human body? It starts breaking down whenever there is lesser gravity. And if there's too much gravity, the same thing. These constants matter. The strength of the electromagnetic and weak nuclear forces. If you change those, what happens? All the electrons fly apart. And, well, again, a bad day. And there are many, many others of these constants. You change any of them by a slight amount, and what happens? Everything falls apart. Well, why is that important? That implies design, that all these things are set in such a way that the world is what it is. We live on a privileged planet. In order for there to be life on this planet, what are some of the things that must be there? Our Earth is in a habitable area of a sun-type star. If the sun were bigger and a different kind of star, we'd all be on a scorched planet. If it were smaller and colder, we'd all freeze to death. The axis tilt on the Earth is in such a way. Our moon is the right size and the right distance and the right location, rotation axis. We have other large planets to prevent asteroids from hitting us. And there's even a protective layer around the Earth that protects us from radiation and from those asteroids. We have the oxygen and the right levels, which is actually scientifically a very difficult and rare thing on the planet. Heating, the heat being held in, the way that the plates move. There's so many things that this scientists realize, well, the chances of this just happening are so mathematically phenomenal, they have to come up with some other explanation as to how this could have happened, because if you just keep rolling the dice, like, you're playing Risk and roll the dice and roll the dice, there are so many dice and so much time required, it can't happen. So they've come up with other theories to explain that, and one of the big ones we see so much in everything now is that there is a multiverse, that there are limitless universes, and most of those are uninhabitable. See how, in my opinion, ridiculous it becomes, because these prejudged ideas that there can't be a God and where it leads people to, and what they have to come up with to make it fit the narrative. And yet, that is what's being taught to our children. That's what's being taught to us on television. How about the cell? I mentioned signature art. I think the cell is a perfect example of God's signature. Now, I talked about DNA already, which is part of the cell, but we have the protein synthesis. That's all. Earlier I was talking about this RNA. And our cells are constantly being replaced. As our cells die off, they are replaced. In fact, approximately every 7 years, every cell in the human body is entirely replaced. And that's all part of this protein synthesis, where we have this DNA, this pattern, signature. Actually, it looks like computer code if you really think about it, that explains how these things are going to be built. Those kind of things don't happen by chance. If you think about what I'm looking at on the screen right now, who would think that my lesson this morning just randomly happened? That I turned my computer on and it had a glitch and all those numbers came out in such a way that this lesson put itself together. Is that believable? Not really. No scientist would claim that. And yet their very argument is that if you rolled the dice enough, an entire work of Shakespeare could come out, right? If you just throw all the letters in there, put it in a computer and just have it start randomly coming up with words, it could eventually write a work of Shakespeare. That's ridiculous. And yet, that's what they are teaching us, and that's what they're trying to teach our kids. Look at the cell structures. Back in the 1960s and 70s, they would tell us that a cell was just, by the way, a cell was even a relatively new idea at that point in time, but they would tell us that a cell was just filled with protoplasm, just goo, right? Because they had no idea what was in there. But the more they began to study to see how they could make a cell, what they find out, there are very complex structures inside that cell. If we were to compare the complexity of a cell, I heard it asked to a scientist, if I compare the complexity of a cell to a computer, would that be right? And he's like, no, it wouldn't. A cell would be more like taking every single computer and every living being in New York City and putting it together. There's the complexity of a cell. So there was a recent survey done among high school and college students. They said, they started with a very complex question. They said, do you think that scientists have been able to create a mammal, what they would call more a higher life form, if you would have it, in the lab? There were some students who said, yes, we believe scientists have been able to successfully create, from just primordial, if you would have it, a mammal in the lab. That is not true. They have not been able to do so. So they said, a smaller question, do you think they have been able to successfully create a, we'll say, something more simple, like a small multicellular organism in the lab? Large percentage said yes. The answer to that is no, they have not been able to do that in the lab. Although if you read science articles, you would think, due to misleading ideas, that yeah, they've been able to. No, they have not. So then the question was, have scientists been able to create the most simple, single cellular organism that we can think of in a lab, just by putting the conditions right and mixing things together? Very large percentage of science students in college said, yes, they've been able to do that. But the answer is, no, they have not been able to do that. In fact, they are light years away in their knowledge of being able to do anything of the kind. And the more they learn, the further they realize they are from being able to do anything of the kind. Just how wonderfully made we are. The signature in the cell tells the signature of a God who created something that is far beyond our knowledge or capability. Which brings us to the question then, what is a man? We've talked about how we have this narrative telling us that man just came from animals, right? I'll read you a short part of an article that I read just about a month ago, maybe months ago. The scientist who studied for many, many years this particular subject says there is no free will. According to Robert Sapolsky, a biologist and neuroscientist at Stanford University, and a recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. Sure, we have a scientist, way more studied than myself, probably much more intelligent than myself, and yet here's what he believes. Dr. Sapolsky worked for decades as a field primatologist before turning to neuroscience, and he has spent his career investigating behavior across the animal kingdom and writing about it in books, including Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, and Monkey Love, and other essays on our lives as animals. His latest book, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will, Dr. Sapolsky confronts and refutes the biological and philosophical arguments for free will. He contends that we are not free agents, but that biology, hormones, childhood, and life circumstances coalesce to produce actions that we merely feel were ours to choose. So what is this scientist saying? He's saying that all of us are nothing more than pure random chance that has caused chemical, electrical, and biological interactions between particles. So whatever you do, you have no choice in. You're just merely matter and energy. And that matter and energy is reacting in such a way that it gives the appearance of intelligence. It gives the appearance of actually doing something productive. But to what end does such reasoning lead? That reasoning leads to the justification of any and everything. What it says is, nothing that I've done is my own fault. And so, no matter what bad I do, well, I was just programmed to do it. I had no choice in the matter. And so, because of that, I don't have any culpability. There is no right and wrong, is where this leads. Somebody might think that there is a giant leap from saying that we evolved from animals into saying that there is no right and wrong, and yet it does lead to that eventual thought that he's come to. But what does the Bible say a man is? Psalm 8:4, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Really, if you think about it, we have this God who created a universe that even to the greatest of scientists is so far beyond our comprehension. Even they will admit that. Such a creator is so far above us. Why is he conscious of us? It shows that not only does God exist, but that he is a personal God who cares about his creation. Psalm 138:14, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. the more I study science, rather than going down the path of saying that all this is random chance and that nothing really matters and that we are nothing more than animals. Instead, I see the design of a creator who created something that he really cares about, that is wonderful and marvelous. And that Genesis 1:27, we're made in God's image. There is the important key. We are made in God's image. What does it matter then? Evolution is dehumanizing. It literally makes us like the animals. And we say, well, what does it matter if maybe I can put the two together. I can take a creation narrative and I can also accept an evolutionary narrative. Can you? The only way to do that is to discount the Genesis narrative, which there are many in the realm of Christianity who try to do that. Why? Exactly that. Why is that? Is it because they doubt the power of God? Is it because they see what scientists say, that a scientist says that the world must be 400 billion years old because, well, that's what it looks like to me? Well, I would like to ask them a question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Why is that question important? Did God create an infant world that had to find its way to maturity? Or did God create a mature world? That question answers that. Evolution's narrative is racist. Many in evolution won't accept it, and yet it stands to reason. If certain men are more involved than other men, what is that? That's racism. It's racist. And it's shown in our history. It's shown in the history of throughout the world wars, in fact. There was a great effect on Hitler of this teaching and on many of the other players in World War II, such as Stalin, and then even later men such as Mao, and how did not believe in a God. So what did they believe in? They believed in something that led them down a path to think that some men were better than other men. In fact, if you look in the United States in the first World's Fair, I think it was around 1912, 1913, I'm not sure, my numbers may be slightly off, but in the World's Fair, they created a village where they brought tribal peoples from around the world, and they put them in this village on display for people to see these lesser men, to see how they live so primitively, slightly more evolved than the apes, and how we were so much higher. And they literally came in and looked at them and laughed, and just like they were at a zoo. It was called the Human Zoo. Where some of this leads whenever we reject God. Evolution's narrative is scientifically unproven because it can't be proven. They will admit themselves. We'll never get there. And unprovable. So it requires faith. Does Christianity require faith? Yes, it absolutely does. So does this narrative. And the narrative is unbiblical. You can't put the two together. Whenever we hear these things, we just, in the background, think, oh, right, the dinosaurs lived long before man. Really? I believe the dinosaurs and man walked the earth at the same time. That may be considered pseudoscience to many. And yet, look in the book of Job where he talks about Leviathan. People say, well, if dinosaurs lived at the same time as man, it'd be in the Bible. Go to the book of Job, I think you'll see it. Hebrews 11:6. Whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. I will agree. There is belief. There is faith. I cannot prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to a person there is a God. If so, I would like to think there'd been many more people Who would believe that? But we can certainly present the evidences just as the realm of, quote, science presents their evidences. What does this have to do with human nature, though? The world is feeding us a narrative. They're giving us a narrative of a creation without a God. And a creation without a God, that Satan would certainly like us to believe.